Human history is an eternal cycle. From the ashes of chaos, order is reborn, and from the pinnacle of glory, the seeds of decay silently sprout. No story demonstrates this grim law more clearly than the story of the Great Tang. It is called the Golden Age, an era where poetry flowed like rivers, where silk and brocade stretched for thousands of miles along the Silk Road, and where the capital city of Chang'an was the center of the civilized world. But the brightest light often conceals the deepest shadows. To understand the beauty of a lotus, one must look down at the mud from which it grows, and to understand the greatness of the Tang, we must return to the moment an old empire was immolating itself in the flames of ambition and tyranny. The Sui Empire, the force that had unified China after 400 years of division, dug its own grave. The burden of its great works and senseless wars had exhausted the treasury and the will of the people. China was once again engulfed in flames. Amidst that vortex, a noble family from the north, the Li clan, saw in the chaos not an apocalypse, but an opportunity. This is their story, the story of a dynasty born from a military coup, consolidated with the blood of brothers, reaching its zenith under a woman who shattered all conventions, and then collapsing from the very contradictions it created. This is the complete chronicle of the Great Tang. In the quiet moonlight, a brush laden with ink moves across silk. It does not hesitate. Each stroke is a universe of meaning, capturing the sorrow of parting, the majesty of a mountain, the fleeting beauty of a plum blossom. This is the creation of something eternal, a verse that will outlast the hand that wrote it and the dynasty that nurtured it. But listen closely. Beneath the rustle of silk, another sound echoes through the corridors of time. It is not the sound of a poet's sigh, but the chilling whisper of steel drawn from its sheath, the grunt of men locked in brutal combat, the final ragged breath of a dying empire. This is the duality that lies at the heart of our story, an age of unparalleled beauty born from an age of unimaginable violence. The empire that the Tang would replace, the Sui dynasty, was not born of weakness. On the contrary, it was a titan, the force that had reunified China after nearly 4 centuries of division and warfare. But it was a titan cursed with a heart that beat too fast and a mind that dreamed too grandly. At its center was Emperor Yang, a man whose vision was as vast as the continent itself and just as unforgiving. He envisioned an empire connected by a waterway that would dwarf any wonder of the ancient world, the Grand Canal, over 2,000 kilometers long, built by the forced labor of more than 5 million people. It was a marvel of engineering, a river of commerce and grain that would feed the capital for centuries. But it was also a river of sweat and tears, a monument built on a foundation of human bones, with historical accounts suggesting that nearly half of its builders perished from toil and disease. But the emperor's ambition did not stop there. He looked north to the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo and saw not a neighbor, but a conquest. In the year 612, he assembled one of the largest armies the world had ever seen, a force of over 1 million soldiers, and hurled it into the unforgiving Korean winter. The campaign was a cataclysmic disaster. The Sui army was annihilated, its supply lines cut, its soldiers frozen and starved. 2 more failed campaigns would follow, each one draining the last drops of blood and treasure from the empire's already exhausted body. The state granaries were empty, the fields were fallow as the farmers had been conscripted for war or monumental construction. Famine had ravaged the land. The mandate of heaven was slipping from the hands of the Sui dynasty, and across the central plains the fires of rebellion were ignited.
Dozens of warlords rose from the chaos, each carving out their own domain. The Titan was not just falling, it was tearing itself apart. Amidst this vortex of collapse, in the strategic northern garrison of Taiyuan, one man watched the empire burn with a calculated patience. He was Li Yuan, the Duke of Tang, a man of distinguished aristocratic lineage, a cousin to the Sui emperor himself, and a seasoned commander. He understood the art of survival, but survival is not the same as conquest. While the father saw the risks of rebellion, the son saw only the prize. Li Yuan's second son was a young man forged in the fire of the frontier. He possessed a strategic mind that saw the entire chessboard of the crumbling empire and a ruthless ambition that would not be denied. He was the hawk circling the battlefield, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was his voice, insistent and brilliant, that pushed his cautious father to make the final, treasonous gamble. In the year 617, the banner of rebellion was raised in Taiyuan. It was a single spark that would soon become an inferno, consuming the old world and forging a new one in its place. This is where our story truly begins, not just with the death of an old dynasty, but with the birth of a new one, conceived in ambition, baptized in blood, and destined for a glory that would echo through eternity. Every empire begins with a gamble. For Li Yuan, the Duke of Tang, it was a wager against the crumbling Sui dynasty, a calculated risk that the mandate of heaven was his for the taking. History often remembers the son, the brilliant warrior who would become Emperor Taizong, but it was the father who took that first perilous step from loyalty to rebellion. Yet his genius son, Li Shimin, understood a grimmer truth. Seizing the world is merely the prelude. The true Game of Thrones only begins when those who share a house, who share the same blood, become rivals for its ownership. The war for China would be fought on the battlefield, but the war for the Tang Dynasty would be fought in the shadows of the palace between brothers. In the 7th month of the year 617, the banners of rebellion unfurled over the city of Taiyuan. Li Yuan declared his a righteous army, rising not to claim the throne for himself, but to restore order and support a worthy prince of the Sui. It was a masterful political stroke, a veil of legitimacy thrown over an act of raw ambition. While other warlords fought bloody, attritional battles, the army of Tang, guided by Li Shimin's strategic insight, moved with purpose. They bypassed well-defended strongholds, striking directly for the heart of power, the western capital, Chang'an. By winter of that same year, the city had fallen.
For Li Yuan, the Duke of Tang, it was a wager against the crumbling Sui dynasty, a calculated risk that the mandate of heaven was his for the taking. History often remembers the son, the brilliant warrior who would become Emperor Taizong, but it was the father who took that first perilous step from loyalty to rebellion. Yet his genius son, Li Shimin, understood a grimmer truth. Seizing the world is merely the prelude. The true Game of Thrones only begins when those who share a house, who share the same blood, become rivals for its ownership. The war for China would be fought on the battlefield, but the war for the Tang Dynasty would be fought in the shadows of the palace between brothers. In the 7th month of the year 617, the banners of rebellion unfurled over the city of Taiyuan. Li Yuan declared his a righteous army, rising not to claim the throne for himself, but to restore order and support a worthy prince of the Sui. It was a masterful political stroke, a veil of legitimacy thrown over an act of raw ambition. While other warlords fought bloody attritional battles, the army of Tang, guided by Li Shimin's strategic insight, moved with purpose.
They bypassed well-defended strongholds, striking directly for the heart of power, the western capital, Chang'an. By winter of that same year, the city had fallen. Its granaries were secured, its population pacified. True to his cautious nature, Li Yuan did not immediately claim the dragon throne. He installed a child prince of the Sui as a puppet emperor, ruling as regent from behind the scenes. He was consolidating his power, winning over local elites, and observing the chaos as his rivals exhausted themselves in endless warfare. The final pretense was shed in the summer of 618. News arrived from the south that the despised Emperor Yang had been assassinated by his own generals. The last vestige of Sui authority was gone. The throne was empty. Li Yuan accepted the inevitable, deposed the puppet prince, and proclaimed the founding of a new dynasty, the Great Tang. He was now Emperor Gaozong. A new era had begun. But to claim a dynasty is not the same as to rule an empire. From his new capital in Chang'an, Gaozong looked out upon a fractured world. To the east, Wang Shichang held the ancient capital of Luoyang. To the north, Liu Wuzhou pressed down from the steppe. In the Great Plains, Dou Jiande commanded a massive peasant army. The board was set. The pieces were in motion. Now the emperor needed a player who could sweep them all away. He needed a sword. He needed his son, Li Shimen, the Prince of Qin. Li Shimen was now unleashed. While his father, the emperor, managed the intricate politics of the new court, Li Shimen returned to the world he knew best, the world of strategy, steel, and battlefield command. His first test came from the west, where the warlord Liu Chaochu threatened the Tang heartland. In an initial encounter, a subordinate Tang commander, eager for glory, attacked against Li Shimen's orders and was soundly defeated. It was a costly lesson, but one that would define the prince's military philosophy. He learned patience. When Yu's son renewed the offensive, Li Shimen refused to be drawn into open battle. For over 60 days he held his army in a defensive posture on the Cheninu plain, weathering insults and provocations. He waited until the enemy's supplies were exhausted and their spirit was dulled. Then, at the perfect moment, he launched a devastating counterattack that utterly crushed the enemy forces. He did not meet brute force with brute force. He met it with discipline and strategic exhaustion. This pattern was repeated in the north against the formidable Liu Wuzhou, who had allied with the Eastern Turks. Again, Li Shimen adopted a strategy of calculated delay. He fortified his positions and cut off Liu Zhou's supply lines, letting the harsh northern winter become his greatest ally. As the enemy army weakened from hunger and cold, their morale collapsed. Li Shimen then struck with overwhelming force, reclaiming all the territory Liu Wu had seized in a lightning campaign. The threats from the west and north had been neutralized, but these were merely preliminary moves on the grand chessboard. The true prize, the heart of China, lay in the central plains. And there, two of the most powerful warlords remained. Wang Shichang, a cunning former Sui general who occupied the great eastern capital of Luoyang, and Dou Jiande, the charismatic leader of a massive peasant army who controlled the territory to the northeast. To defeat them was to win the empire. In the year 620, Li Shimen marched his army east towards Luoyang. This was not just another city, it was the ancient heart of the empire, a symbol of ultimate legitimacy. The siege that followed was a grinding, brutal affair. Wang Shichang was trapped, but his defenses were strong. As the siege dragged on, he sent a desperate message to his only potential savior, his rival, Dou Jiande. Dou Jiande understood the stakes perfectly. If Wang Shichong fell, he would be next. Assembling a formidable army, reportedly over 100,000 strong, he marched west to break the Tang siege. Li Shimin now faced a commander's ultimate nightmare, a fortified enemy in front of him and a massive relief force approaching from his rear. Conventional wisdom dictated a retreat, but Li Shimin's genius lay in defying convention. He made an audacious decision. He would leave the bulk of his army to continue the siege of Luoyang, and with a small elite force of just a few thousand cavalry, he would ride to intercept Dou Jiande. The fate of the empire would be decided not in a prolonged siege, but in a single lightning strike of violence at a narrow mountain pass. That pass was Hula. In May of 621, the two armies faced each other. Dou Jiande, confident in his superior numbers, sought a decisive battle. Li Shimin once again employed his strategy of patience, holding the strategic pass for days, weathering skirmishes, and waiting for the enemy to grow impatient. Then, at the perfect moment, he launched a devastating counterattack that utterly crushed the enemy forces. He did not meet brute force with brute force. He met it with discipline and strategic exhaustion. This pattern was repeated in the north against the formidable Yu Wuzhou, who had allied with the Eastern Turks. Again, Li Shimin adopted a strategy of calculated delay. He fortified his positions and cut off Liu Zhou's supply lines, letting the harsh northern winter become his greatest ally. As the enemy army weakened from hunger and cold, their morale collapsed. Li Shimin then struck with overwhelming force, reclaiming all the territory Liu Wu had seized in a lightning campaign. The threats from the west and north had been neutralized, but these were merely preliminary moves on the grand chessboard. The true prize, the heart of China, lay in the central plains. And there, two of the most powerful warlords remained. Wang Shichong, a cunning former Sui general who occupied the great eastern capital of Luoyang, and Dou Jiande, the charismatic leader of a massive peasant army who controlled the territory to the northeast. To defeat them was to win the empire. In the year 620, Li Shimin marched his army east towards Luoyang. This was not just another city, it was the ancient heart of the empire, a symbol of ultimate legitimacy. The siege that followed was a grinding, brutal affair. Wang Shichong was trapped, but his defenses were strong. As the siege dragged on, he sent a desperate message to his only potential savior, his rival, Dou Jiande. Dou Jiande understood the stakes perfectly. If Wang Shichong fell, he would be next. Assembling a formidable army, reportedly over 100,000 strong, he marched west to break the Tang siege. Li Shimin now faced a commander's ultimate nightmare, a fortified enemy in front of him and a massive relief force approaching from his rear. Conventional wisdom dictated a retreat, but Li Shimin's genius lay in defying convention. He made an audacious decision. He would leave the bulk of his army to continue the siege of Luoyang, and with a small elite force of just a few thousand cavalry, he would ride to intercept Dou Jiande. The fate of the empire would be decided not in a prolonged siege, but in a single lightning strike of violence at a narrow mountain pass. That pass was Hula. In May of 621, the two armies faced.
Li Shimin was now cornered. He had conquered armies on the battlefield, but he was losing the war of attrition in the court. His allies were being scattered. His life was under constant threat. His most trusted strategists gave him a stark choice: act now or wait for the executioner's axe. The hero who had unified China was now forced to contemplate the ultimate act of treason to save himself, to strike first against his own blood, inside the very heart of the empire he had helped create. The time for whispers was over. The time for steel had come. History records it as a coup, an assassination. For Li Shimin, it was an act of survival. On the night before the fateful day, a secret report reached his residence. His brother's ambush was set for the following morning. The choice was now simple: to walk into his own execution or to set a trap of his own. He chose the latter. With his core loyalists, including the brilliant strategist Jiangsun Wuji and the fearsome general Yu Qigong, the plan was finalized. The key was the Xuanwu Gate, the northern entrance to the palace city, a place of immense strategic importance. Through bribery and persuasion, Li Shimin's men had already gained the loyalty of the gate's commander. Before dawn, they would occupy the gate and wait. On the morning of July 2nd in the year 626, a thick fog clung to the imperial capital of Chang'an. The air was cool and silent, the quiet before a storm. Concealed within the shadows of the gatehouse, Li Shimin and a handful of his most trusted men held their breath, their hands gripping their weapons. They listened. Soon they heard it, the sound of hoofbeats approaching through the mist. The crown prince Li Jian and the prince of Qi, Li Yuanji, were riding towards the gate for their morning audience with their father, confident that their own trap was ready to be sprung. As they neared the gate, something felt wrong. The usual guards were absent. An unnatural stillness hung in the air. Li Jian suddenly reined in his horse, his face filled with suspicion. He turned to flee, but it was too late. From the shadows, Li Shimin emerged, his bow already drawn and aimed at his older brother. The ambush was sprung. There was no longer any room for words, no possibility of retreat. In the cold morning light, the final bloody chapter of the brothers' war was about to be written. The bowstring sang, the arrow flew true. Li Jian, the crown prince of the great Tang, fell from his horse, struck down by his younger brother. Chaos erupted. Li Yuanji, seeing his brother fall, drew his own bow and fired at Li Shimin, but missed. The exchange of fire spooked Li Shimin's horse, which bolted into a nearby wood, throwing its rider to the ground. In an instant, the hunter became the hunted. Li Yuanji dismounted and seized his brother's bow, attempting to strangle him with the string. For a critical moment, the fate of the future dynasty hung by a thread, decided not by armies, but by a desperate struggle in the dirt. Just then, the general Yu Qigong arrived on horseback at full gallop. He cut down Li Yuanji with a volley of arrows. The fight was over. The brothers were dead, but the coup was not yet complete. Power was not secured by blood alone. It had to be legitimized by the emperor. Leaving his men to deal with the followers of the dead princess, Yu Qigong, still in full armor and stained with the morning's violence, marched directly into the heart of the palace. He found Emperor Gaozu boating on a palace lake, a scene of tranquility about to be shattered. The sight of the fearsome, blood-splattered general was a terrifying intrusion. Without ceremony, Yu Qigong announced that the crown prince and the prince of Qi had committed treason and had been executed by the prince of Qin, who was now acting to protect the throne. It was a masterful lie, a truth wrapped in a threat. Gaozu understood immediately. His sons were dead. An armed warrior was standing before him, delivering a message from his other victorious son. He had no troops, no power, no choice. On the advice of his ministers, who quickly fell in line with the new reality, Emperor Gaozu issued an edict. He named Li Shimin the new crown prince and ordered all forces to obey his commands. The gamble at the Xuanwu Gate had paid off. The son who had won the empire now possessed it. For 2 months, a grim charade played out in the court, with Emperor Gaozu as a ruler in name only, and the new crown prince holding all true authority. Then, in the 9th month of 626, the final act came. The founding emperor of the Tang Dynasty abdicated the throne he had held for a mere 8 years. Li Shimin, the victor of the Xuanwu Gate, ascended to become the second emperor of the Tang. He is known to history as Emperor Taizong.
He had the throne, he had the power, but his reign began with an incurable wound, an original sin. In the eyes of Confucian morality, he was a usurper who had committed the ultimate crimes, fratricide, and a violation of filial piety. How could such a man claim the mandate of heaven? How could he rule as a moral exemplar to the world? He answered this question not with words, but with his actions. For the next 23 years, his reign, known as the reign of Zhen Guan, became a conscious and relentless effort to justify his bloody path to power. He seemed determined to become the greatest emperor in China's history, perhaps to wash away the stains of the past. He recruited men of talent, regardless of their background, even employing officials who had faithfully served his dead brothers. He fostered an atmosphere where honest criticism was not just tolerated, but demanded. His relationship with the famously blunt minister Wei Zhen, who served as his unforgiving mirror, became legendary. The reign of Zhen Guan would become the gold standard of good governance for all future dynasties, a period of unparalleled peace, stability, and prosperity. But it was a golden age built upon a foundation of blood and betrayal, forever posing a haunting question: can the glories of a reign truly redeem the sins committed to achieve it? For 23 years, the reign of Emperor Taizong was an era of unparalleled strength and clarity. But even the greatest titans must fall. In the year 649, the emperor passed away, leaving the dragon throne to his son, Li Ji, who would become Emperor Gaozong. The son was not the father. Where Taizong was decisive and martial, Gaozong was scholarly, pious, and prone to bouts of ill health. He was a benevolent man, but a weak-willed emperor, and in the fertile ground of his gentle court an extraordinary seed planted during his father's reign began to sprout. By all tradition, upon the death of an emperor, his childless concubines were to have their heads shaved and live out their days in monastic seclusion. Among them was a junior concubine, a Kairen of the late Emperor Taizong, a woman whose sharp intellect had once caught the great emperor's attention, but who had otherwise been consigned to obscurity. Her name was Wu Zhao.
She was supposed to be a forgotten postscript to a closed chapter of history. Instead, she would become its author. The Gaian Temple was a place where history ended. For the countless women sent there, its cold stone walls were a final, silent tomb for their ambitions. But for Wu Zhao, it was merely a waiting room. Her connection to the new emperor, Gaozong, had been forged in the final years of his father's reign. While attending to the ailing Emperor Taizong, the young crown prince Li Ji had become captivated by the intelligence and beauty of his father's junior concubine. Their bond was a secret, a transgression, a promise whispered in the shadows of a dying emperor's court. Upon Taizong's death, tradition took its course, and she was sent away. But the new emperor did not forget. On an anniversary of his father's death, Gaozong visited the temple to offer incense, and the carefully planned encounter took place. Seeing her, his old affection was rekindled. In a move that defied centuries of ritual propriety, the emperor arranged for Wu Zhao to be brought back to the palace. She did not return as a forgotten relic of a past reign. Her head was no longer shaved. Her monastic robes were replaced with silk. She was given the high-ranking title of Xiaoya, a concubine of the second rank, and became a formal member of Emperor Gaozong's harem. The game had begun anew. The current powers of the harem were Empress Wang, a woman of high birth but childless and neglected by the emperor, and the noble consort Xiao, who was favored and had borne him a son. In a fatal political miscalculation, Empress Wang actually supported Wu Zhao's return, hoping to use her to divert the emperor's affection from her rival, consort Xiao. The empress believed she could control this newcomer. It was the mistake of inviting a tigress into her home to chase away a wild cat. Wu Zhao was different. Where the empress was proud and the consort was arrogant, Wu was intelligent, deferential, and understood the emperor's gentle and often insecure nature perfectly. She quickly became his confidant, his intellectual partner, and his most cherished companion, eclipsing all others. The Empress's scheme had backfired spectacularly. The newcomer she intended to use as a pawn had become the queen on the chessboard. The temporary alliance shattered, replaced by a cold war that gripped the inner palace. Empress Wang and consort Shao, once bitter rivals, now united in their fear and hatred of Wu Zhao. But they were outmatched. They fought with pride and status. Wu fought with intelligence and a chilling understanding of human emotion. Then, in the year 654, Wu gave birth to a daughter. This should have been a moment of vulnerability. It became her deadliest weapon. The story, as recorded by later historians hostile to her, is the stuff of nightmares. Empress Wang, childless herself, paid a visit to admire the infant princess. Shortly after she left, the baby was discovered to have been suffocated in her crib. When the emperor arrived, Wu Zhao greeted him with tears, subtly pointing the finger of blame at the last person to have seen the child alive. The heartbroken emperor, already deeply in love with Wu and resentful of the empress, needed little convincing. He was enraged. This event has become the cornerstone of Wu Zhao's villainous reputation, the monstrous mother who murdered her own child for political gain. But is that the only truth? This is a history written by her enemies, by Confucian scholars who saw her reign as an abomination. Could the empress, in a fit of desperate jealousy, have actually committed the crime? Could the infant have succumbed to what we would now call sudden infant death syndrome, a tragedy that Wu, a master politician, simply exploited? The truth is lost to time. What is certain is the result. The death of the infant princess was the blow that broke the opposition. It gave Gaozong the moral justification he needed against the furious objections of the old guard of chancellors, men who had served his father and saw the empress as a symbol of stability. Gaozong stood firm. In late 655, Empress Wang and consort Shao were stripped of their titles and thrown into a dark prison. And Wu Zhao, the former concubine, the former nun, was formally enthroned as the new empress of the Great Tang. Her defeated rivals would later be executed in a gruesome manner, their limbs cut off, their bodies thrown into wine vats. The empress had shown the court that her smile was as brilliant as her cruelty was absolute. Having conquered the harem, Empress Wu now turned her gaze to a much larger domain, the empire itself. Her victory was not merely a personal triumph, it was the acquisition of a legitimate platform from which to wield influence, and the opportunity to do so arrived sooner than anyone expected. Emperor Gaozong, never a man of robust health, began to suffer from a debilitating illness. Historical descriptions are consistent with severe hypertension or a series of strokes, afflictions that brought on crippling dizziness and blurred his vision, making the daily task of reading state memorials and ruling the vast empire an impossibility. A vacuum of power was forming at the very center of the Tang court, and Empress Wu, intelligent, ambitious, and always prepared, stepped in to fill the vacuum. At first, she simply assisted. Sitting behind a silk screen behind the emperor's throne during audiences, she would read the memorials to him and offer her counsel. But as Gaozong's condition worsened, her role evolved. Her counsel became instruction, her suggestions became decisions, her voice became the voice of the emperor. It quickly became apparent that she was not merely a proxy, she was a political talent of the first order. In the year 674, she submitted a formal policy paper known as the 12 Suggestions. These were not the machinations of a court intriguer, they were the proposals of a serious stateswoman. She advocated for encouraging agriculture, reducing taxes, ending conscription for wasteful military campaigns, and promoting officials based on merit, not birthright. She understood the foundations of state power, and she knew how to strengthen them. Her grasp of policy and her decisive nature stood in contrast to her ailing, indecisive husband.
The court began to whisper. Then the whispers became common parliaments.
The people of the empire no longer spoke of one ruler, but of two. They were called the Two Saints, the Emperor and the Empress, ruling together as equals. It was an unprecedented reality. A woman was not just influencing policy from the shadows, she was openly co-ruling one of the most powerful empires on Earth. For the old guard of Confucian chancellors, this was more than a crisis. It was an abomination, a perversion of the sacred order of heaven and earth, and they would not allow it to stand. The confrontation was inevitable. The old guard chancellors, led by the respected Shangguan Yi, saw a moment of opportunity when the emperor expressed his own frustration at the empress's dominance. Secretly, they drafted an edict to depose her. But the empress had eyes and ears everywhere. As the ink on the edict was still drying, she learned of the plot. She did not send a surrogate. She did not wait. She marched into the emperor's chambers herself and confronted him directly. The scene was one of ultimate political theater. The emperor, weak and startled, sat with the evidence of his betrayal before him. The empress did not plead, nor did she weep. She argued. She interrogated. She systematically dismantled his justifications, reminding him of her contributions and his own reliance on her. Faced with her towering personality and iron will, the emperor's resolve crumbled completely. In a spectacular act of cowardice, he blamed everything on the man who had tried to help him. He pointed to Shangguan Yi and said, "He taught me to do this." The fate of the chancellor was sealed. This was the opening the empress needed. She accused Shangguan Yi and his faction not of opposing her, but of plotting treason against the emperor himself. A swift and brutal purge followed. The chancellors who had dared to defy her were executed, their families exiled. The last bastion of organized opposition within the court was annihilated. After this incident, Emperor Gaozong never again challenged her authority. He became a shadow on the throne, presiding over ceremonies while the empress governed the empire. His health continued its slow, inexorable decline. Finally, in the year 683, the emperor died. After 3 decades of scheming, fighting, and ruling from behind the curtain, Empress Wu was now left in sole command of the empire. She was no longer a wife or a co-ruler. She was the Empress Daija, the regent for her son, the new emperor, Jiangzong. The era of the Two Saints was officially over. Now there was only one, and she was just getting started. The dragon throne was occupied by her son Li Xian, now Emperor Zhongsong, but the hand that moved the pieces belonged to the Empress Daija. The new emperor, young and arrogant, failed to understand this new reality. In a foolish attempt to assert his authority, he tried to appoint his father-in-law to the high post of chancellor. For Wu Zetian, this was not merely a political misstep, it was an act of defiance. She would not tolerate it. After a mere 6 weeks on the throne, the Empress Daija marched into the imperial court, publicly read a list of charges against her son, and had him deposed. The emperor was stripped of his title, placed under house arrest, and exiled. The message to the court and the world was unequivocal. The bloodline of the Li family now mattered less than the will of the woman who had married into it. In his place, she installed her younger and more docile son Li Dan as the new emperor Rizong. He was a ruler in name only, a virtual prisoner in the inner palace who was not permitted to rule on any state affairs. Wu Zetian, as Empress Daija, now governed openly, but she knew her position was precarious. As long as she ruled in the name of a Tang emperor, the powerful Li imperial clan, with its dozens of princes spread across the empire, remained a mortal threat. To secure her future, she decided to eliminate that threat with systematic preemptive terror. She established a network of secret police led by a cohort of notoriously cruel officials known as the Ko-Tree Order. Men like the infamous Lai Yunin became the architects of a new era of fear.
A copper box was installed in the capital with 4 slots, inviting the public to submit petitions. But it was the 4th slot, for secret accusations, that became the most feared instrument in the empire. Anonymous denunciations flowed in. Anyone suspected of disloyalty, anyone with a powerful enemy could be dragged from their home, handed over to the secret police, and tortured until they confessed to any crime imaginable. An atmosphere of suffocating paranoia descended upon the empire. For 15 years she ruled as emperor. Her Zhou dynasty was a period of relative stability. She continued to empower scholar officials from the examination system, launched successful military campaigns to defend the borders, and the empire, for the most part, remained prosperous. But she could never solve the ultimate paradox of her own creation.
Her dynasty was the Zhou, but her only possible heirs were her sons, whose surname was Li. They were princes of the Tang. If she passed the throne to one of them, would they honor her as the founding emperor of a new dynasty, or simply as an empress of the Tang who had temporarily interrupted their family's rule? If she passed it to a nephew from her own Wu clan, she would be violating the deepest traditions of ancestral worship. The political genius who had outmaneuvered every rival was finally trapped by a problem she could not solve. In the year 705, old and ailing, she was finally vulnerable. A group of loyalist Tang officials staged a palace coup, forcing her to abdicate in favor of her son, the exiled Zhongzong. The Tang Dynasty was restored. Wu Zichen, the woman who had ruled China for nearly half a century, died peacefully later that year. Her final act was perhaps her most enigmatic. For her tombstone, she left an order: leave it blank. The famous Wu Bei, the blank stele, stands to this day, a silent monument to a life that defied simple description. Was it an act of humility, acknowledging that her sins and merits were too vast for any inscription to capture? Or was it an act of supreme confidence, a final challenge to history, believing that her accomplishments needed no words, for they were written across the face of the empire itself? Her legacy is that very ambiguity. She was a tyrant who ruled through terror, and a brilliant stateswoman who promoted meritocracy. She was a murderer who brought stability. She was the ultimate contradiction, a woman who became emperor, a force of nature that remade the world around her. And her blank monument is the perfect epitaph, inviting every generation to judge her anew. The storm of Empress Wu had passed, but the sky was not yet clear. The Tang court, having just restored the Li family, was immediately plunged back into a chaotic struggle for power, with ambitious empresses and princesses attempting to emulate Wu's rise. For a few short years, coups and conspiracies were the new norm. Out of this turmoil, a new strongman emerged. He was Li Longji, a grandson of Wu Zichen, a young prince who possessed both his grandmother's ruthlessness and his great-grandfather Taizong's vision. In a series of decisive moves, he crushed the plots of his rivals and secured the throne for himself in the year 712. He is known to history as Emperor Xuanzong. Under his leadership, the empire was about to enter its second and most dazzling golden age. His early reign would be remembered as the Kaiyuan era, a period when the Tang Dynasty would reach its absolute zenith, a height of cultural splendor and economic power that would radiate across all of Asia. But every great fire burns brightest just before it is extinguished. Emperor Xuanzong would preside over the Tang Dynasty's greatest glory and its most profound tragedy. The young Emperor Xuanzong ascended the throne with the energy of a storm. He had witnessed firsthand the decay and corruption that had plagued the court, and he was determined to restore the discipline and glory of his great-grandfather, Taizong's reign of Zhenguan. His first actions were swift and decisive. He purged the administration of thousands of redundant officials who had bought their positions or were appointed through courtly favor during the previous chaotic years. He moved to curb the lavish expenditures of the imperial clan and put a stop to the construction of opulent Buddhist monasteries that were draining the state's wealth.
But Xuanzang understood that a great ruler is defined not just by his own actions, but by the men he chooses to advise him, and in this he initially proved to be a master. He sought out the most capable statesmen in the empire, empowering them to enact sweeping reforms. The first of these great chancellors was Yao Chong, a veteran official of immense experience. Yao Chong presented the emperor with a 10-point proposal that would become the blueprint for the Kai-Yuan era success. He demanded that the emperor cease the practice of allowing eunuchs to interfere in state affairs, that the influence of imperial relatives in government be curtailed, and that all officials be judged on merit, not connections. He insisted on a return to the rule of law over personal favor and pushed for policies that supported the peasantry, the true bedrock of the empire's strength. The emperor agreed to all of it. Under Yao Chong's guidance, the bloated and corrupt administration was streamlined into an efficient, meritocratic machine. After Yao Chong set the direction, his successor, Song Jing, built the lasting structure. Song Jing was a man utterly devoted to principle and the rule of law. He ensured that the tax system was fair, that promotions were based on performance, and that the authority of the central government was respected. Together, these two men, empowered by a trusting and energetic emperor, laid the political and economic foundation for the Golden Age. The endless court intrigues of the past decades faded. The state treasury, once depleted, began to overflow. A sense of confidence and purpose returned to the empire. The stage was now set for the most brilliant cultural flourishing in China's history. With peace in the land and silver in the treasury, the empire's creative spirit was unleashed in a way the world had never seen. At the heart of it all was the capital, Chang'an, a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million souls, meticulously laid out in a grid of wide avenues and bustling wards. It was without question the greatest and most cosmopolitan city on earth. Its great western and eastern markets were a vibrant mosaic of humanity. Sogdian merchants from Samarkand hawked exotic glassware. Persian nobles who had fled the Arab conquests opened taverns, and Japanese and Korean students came to study the classics. Spices from the Indies, fine horses from the fair Ghana Valley, and strange new music from Central Asia all flowed into this heart of the empire. The city was a testament to the Tang's defining characteristic, a profound and confident openness to the outside world. This confidence fueled an unprecedented cultural explosion, and the highest expression of the Tang spirit was its poetry. Two figures, in their genius and their contrast, defined the era. The first was Li Bai, the poet immortal, a wild, romantic Taoist wanderer. His verses are filled with moonlight, wine, and a soaring freedom of spirit. He wrote of conversing with the moon and drinking with his own shadow, a genius unburdened by convention. The second was Du Fu, the poet sage, a meticulous craftsman and a deeply compassionate Confucian.
His work was grounded in the harsh realities of life. He wrote of the suffering of common soldiers, the sorrow of families torn apart by war, and the failures of the state. If Li Bai was the soaring spirit of the High Tang, Du Fu was its conscience. Alongside them were masters like Wang Wei, whose brush and pen captured the serene beauty of the natural world in both painting and verse. Music and dance flourished, absorbing new influences from the Silk Road. The arts were not merely a pastime for the elite, they were the very pulse of the age. For a few brief, shining decades, the Tang Dynasty was more than just an empire. It was a civilization at its absolute zenith, convinced of its own power, its own beauty, and its own permanence. But permanence is an illusion, and even the brightest sun must eventually begin to set. After nearly 3 decades of diligent rule, a change came over Emperor Xuanzang. Now, in his later years, he grew weary of the daily demands of governance. Confident that the empire was secure and prosperous, he began to withdraw from the court, dedicating his time to his passions for music, poetry, and Taoist mysticism.
As he retreated, a vacuum of power formed, and a new kind of minister stepped in to fill it. This was not a statesman in the mold of Yao Chong or Song Jing. This was Li Linfu, a man who would come to be described with a chilling phrase: a mouth of honey, a stomach of swords. Li Linfu was a master of court intrigue and psychological manipulation. He understood that the aging emperor no longer wanted to be challenged with difficult problems. He wanted to be reassured. Li Linfu gave him that reassurance. He flattered the emperor, simplified complex issues, and systematically eliminated any talented official who dared to offer honest, critical advice. He purged the court of its best and brightest, replacing them with his own corrupt sycophants, creating a government that was loyal only to him. With his court now a hollowed-out echo chamber, the emperor became increasingly detached from reality, a process that was accelerated by a final, all-consuming obsession. In his 60s, Xuanzang fell completely and utterly in love with Yang Yuhuan, the wife of one of his own sons. In a scandalous move, he arranged for her to join his harem, giving her the title of Guifei, or noble consort. Yang Guifei became the singular focus of his world. He showered her and her family with unimaginable wealth and honor. While she herself may not have been a malicious political actor, her influence was catastrophic. Her corrupt and incompetent cousin, Yang Guozhong, rose to become chancellor, rivaling Li Linfu in a new round of poisonous court intrigue. The emperor, blinded by love and insulated from reality by his flattering ministers, was no longer governing. The magnificent facade of the Kaiyuan era remained, but behind the curtain, the foundations of the state were rotting away. While the court rotted from within, a new and dangerous power was growing on the empire's northeastern frontier. To defend its vast borders, the Tang had created the Jidushi system, powerful military governors who were given immense autonomy over their regions. These men were the shield of the empire, but a shield can also be used as a weapon. And no Jidushi was more powerful or more ambitious than a man named An Lushan. He was not a traditional Chinese aristocrat. He was a man of the frontier, of mixed Sogdian and Turkic blood, a so-called barbarian in the eyes of the court elite. He was cunning, ruthless, and a master of flattery. Despite being enormously overweight, he would play the part of a bumbling, harmless fool, a persona that disarmed the court and charmed the aging emperor. His primary target was not the emperor's mind, but his heart. He focused his efforts on ingratiating himself with the emperor's beloved Yang Guifei. In a spectacle that perfectly captured the absurdity of the late Kaiyuan court, the middle-aged, obese general asked the much younger noble consort to formally adopt him as her son. The emperor, amused, allowed it. A bizarre ceremony was held, where An Lushan, wrapped in swaddling clothes, was presented to his new mother. It was a humiliating display, but An Lushan knew that power was worth any price. Behind this clownish facade, however, was a deadly, serious accumulation of military might. In a catastrophic failure of judgment, Emperor Xuanzang and his chancellor Li Linfu allowed An Lushan to take command of not one, but 3 of the most powerful frontier garrisons simultaneously. He controlled nearly 200,000 of the empire's best, most battle-hardened troops. These soldiers were not loyal to the Tang Dynasty. They were loyal to him, the commander who paid their salaries and led them in battle. After Li Linfu's death, the new chancellor, Yang Guozhong, immediately recognized the threat An Lushan posed to his own power. A bitter rivalry began. Yang Guozhong constantly warned the emperor that An Lushan was plotting rebellion while simultaneously taking actions to provoke him. The stage for the greatest tragedy in the dynasty's history was now set. A distracted emperor, a corrupt and paranoid court, and a massively powerful general on the frontier who now believed his only path to survival was to march on the capital. In the winter of the year 755, the mask finally dropped. Claiming he was marching to cleanse the court of the corrupt chancellor Yang Guangyo, An Lushan unleashed his massive, battle-hardened army. They moved south with terrifying speed. The imperial court, which had dismissed warnings for years, was thrown into a state of panic and disbelief. The Tang Empire discovered a fatal truth. Its best armies were all on the distant frontiers. The forces defending the heartland were parade ground soldiers, completely unprepared for the ferocity of An Lushan's veterans. The response was a catastrophe of incompetence. Xuanzang, rattled and poorly advised, made a series of disastrous decisions. Facing little meaningful resistance, the rebel army swept down the plains. Within a month, they had captured the great eastern capital of Laoyan. There, An Lushan cast aside all pretense and declared himself the first emperor of a new dynasty, the Great Yan. The only thing now standing between the rebels and the primary capital of Chang'an was the strategic Tong Pass, a nearly impregnable mountain gateway. The seasoned Tong general Geishu Han was tasked with its defense. He understood the situation perfectly. He fortified the pass and refused to be drawn out, planning to hold his position and wait for the rebel army to exhaust its momentum. It was the only viable strategy. But back in the capital, the paranoid chancellor Yang Guozhang feared that Geishu Han was secretly plotting against him. He convinced the emperor that the general was a coward for not attacking. Xuanzang, a ghost of the decisive leader he once was, agreed. He sent a direct order to Geishu Han: leave the fortress and engage the enemy on open ground. It was a suicide mission.
The general, bound by his oath of loyalty, marched his army out of their impregnable fortress and into the rebel trap. The great Tang army was annihilated. The last shield had shattered. The road to Chang'an was now wide open. When news of the disaster reached Chang'an, the city that had been the confident heart of the world for over a century fell into chaos. The great Emperor Xuanzang, the son of heaven, did the unthinkable. In the dead of night, he fled his own capital, a refugee in his own empire, accompanied only by his family, Yang Guozhang, and a small retinue of terrified courtiers and resentful imperial guards. The entourage was a pathetic shadow of its former glory. Exhausted and demoralized, they stopped at a small relay post called Mai. There, the soldiers' simmering anger finally boiled over. They blamed one man for their suffering, for the loss of their homes, for the entire disaster, the chancellor, Yang Guozhang. They mutinied, seizing the chancellor and hacking him to pieces. But their rage was not satisfied. They surrounded the pavilion where the emperor was sheltering, their weapons drawn. They believed the true root of the rot, Yang Guifei, was still alive, and as long as she lived, the hated Yang clan could rise again. Their demand was unspoken but brutally clear. The emperor, horrified, confronted his own guards, pleading with them. But his own commander informed him of the grim reality. The army would not be pacified unless the noble consort was delivered to them. The emperor of the Great Tang was now a hostage to his own men. He was faced with an impossible choice: die with the woman he loved or save his own life by condemning her. Heartbroken, he surrendered. Yang Guifei, the most famous beauty of her age, was led to a nearby Buddhist shrine by a eunuch and strangled with a length of silk. The dream of the Kaiyuan era did not die on a battlefield. It died on a dusty road at a forgotten relay post with the execution of a beloved concubine. The great emperor was now a broken old man, his authority shattered, his heart destroyed. The golden age had ended in blood, tears, and absolute disgrace. After the horror of Mai, Emperor Xuanzang was a ghost. He continued his flight south to the remote safety of Sichuan, but power had already passed to a new generation. His son,
the crown prince broke away and traveled north to rally the remaining Tang forces. Soon after, Xuanzang would abdicate, ending one of the longest and most consequential reigns in Chinese history. The dynasty would eventually suppress the rebellion, but the war raged for nearly a decade, long after An Lushan himself was assassinated by his own son. It was a Pyrrhic victory, won at a cost that shattered the very soul of the empire. The numbers tell a story of almost unimaginable horror. The imperial census before the rebellion recorded a population of nearly 53 million. After the war, it was less than 17 million. While not all of these were deaths, the figures represent a demographic collapse on a scale rarely seen in human history. To win the war, the Tang was forced to make a devil's bargain. They granted immense power to new military governors, the Jiedushi, creating a dozen more potential An Lushans across the empire. The central government in Chang'an never truly regained control of the provinces again. The supreme confidence and cosmopolitan openness of the High Tang vanished, replaced by suspicion and xenophobia. The Tang Dynasty would survive for another 100 years, but it was a fundamentally different entity. It was a giant with a broken spine, an empire that had lost its vibrant, beating heart on a dusty road at Mai. The Golden Age was over. The dragon had not been slain, but its spine was broken. For the next century and a half, the Tang Dynasty would continue to exist, but it was a mere shadow of its former self, an empire living with a mortal wound that would never heal. The story of this long decline is no longer a tale of great emperors forging golden ages. The protagonists of this final tragic act are not the men on the throne, many of whom were weak, young, or simply puppets. The real story is about the two parasitic forces that grew out of the ashes of the An Lushan rebellion, two cancers that would slowly consume the giant from within. The first were the eunuchs who seized control of the palace, the imperial armies, and the emperors themselves. The second was the Jiedushi, the regional military governors who ruled their provinces like independent kings, leaving the imperial court with only the illusion of authority. This is the story of how an empire dies not in a single blaze of glory, but by 1,000 cuts, in a slow, agonizing bleed-out that lasted 150 years. Of the two cancers that consumed the late Tang, the first grew within the very walls of the imperial palace. For centuries, eunuchs had been a feature of court life. They were servants, guardians of the harem, and personal attendants, castrated to ensure they could pose no threat to the imperial bloodline. They were considered a class apart, traditionally barred from holding any real political or military power. But the An Lushan rebellion shattered this tradition. In the chaos of the emperor's flight, the emperors who followed Xuanzang came to deeply distrust their own generals and ministers, looking for a force that would be unconditionally loyal to the throne alone. They made a fatal miscalculation. They turned to the eunuchs. They created a new elite palace army, the formidable Shensei army, and gave its command to their most trusted eunuch attendants. In an attempt to cure the disease of warlordism, the Tang emperors had infected themselves with a new, more insidious cancer. The Shen army was the most powerful military force in the capital region. Whoever controlled it controlled the palace, and whoever controlled the palace controlled the emperor. The emperor was now a gilded prisoner, his safety dependent on the very eunuchs who served him. The first to demonstrate this terrifying new power was the eunuch Li Hui, who had protected Emperor Suzong during the rebellion. His influence became so great that he acted as a de facto emperor, making key decisions and treating ministers with contempt. In a shocking display of audacity, he assassinated Emperor Suzong's wife, Empress Zhang, when she dared to plot against him. Then he effectively became the kingmaker, placing the next emperor, Daozong, on the throne. The message was clear. The eunuchs were no longer servants, they were masters. This power bred unimaginable corruption.
The eunuchs established what became known as the palace market, using their authority to extort merchants, seize property, and sell government offices to the highest bidder, rotting the administration from the inside out. While the heart of the empire was being consumed by eunuchs in the palace, its limbs were tearing themselves away from the body. The very solution that had ended the Anlushan rebellion, the empowerment of regional military governors, the Jiedushi, had become a chronic, incurable disease. Before the rebellion, these were appointed officials loyal to the throne. After, they became kings in all but name. Their power was absolute within their own domains, built upon three pillars that shattered imperial authority. First, their positions became hereditary. When a Jiedushi died, his command was passed not to a new appointee from the capital, but to his son or to the strongest of his subordinate generals. Second, they commanded their own private armies, legions of professional soldiers who were fed, paid, and promoted by the warlord himself. Their loyalty was to their commander, not to a distant emperor they had never seen. And third, and most critically, they seized control of the state's revenue. They collected taxes from the vast populations they ruled, but that money no longer flowed to the treasury in Shangan. It stayed in the provinces, funding their armies and their personal ambitions. The Tang was starved of the resources it needed to function, becoming impoverished even as the empire itself remained wealthy. The map of the Tang Empire had become a fiction. In reality, it was a fractured mosaic of dozens of semi-independent military fiefs, with the emperor only exercising true control over the area immediately surrounding the capital. The decline was not entirely linear. There were brief flashes of restored glory. In the early 9th century, the resolute Emperor Shanzang launched a series of brilliant military campaigns against the most defiant warlords. For a short time, in what became known as the Yuanha Restoration, it seemed as if imperial authority could be reasserted. But this success depended entirely on the will of one strong emperor. After Shanzang was assassinated, likely by eunuchs who feared his growing power, his achievements unraveled almost immediately. The system was too broken for any single individual to fix. The warlords were the new reality. While the elites feasted on the carcass of the dying empire, the common people suffered. Crushing taxes levied by warlords, combined with a series of severe floods and droughts in the late 9th century, pushed the peasantry to the brink of starvation. All that was needed was a spark to ignite the powder keg. That spark was a man named Huang Chao. He was a salt smuggler, a man who had repeatedly failed the prestigious imperial examinations, leaving him educated, ambitious, and filled with a bitter resentment for the Tang elite. In 875, he joined a growing peasant uprising, and with his superior organizational skills, he soon became its leader. The Hongqiao Rebellion was not a regional revolt. It was a deluge of destruction that swept across the empire for a decade. Finally, in the year 881, the unthinkable happened. Hongqiao's massive army captured the imperial capital of Chang'an. The city that had once been the glittering center of the world was subjected to a horrific sack. Its palaces were looted, its libraries burned, and its people were massacred. The symbolic heart of the Tang Dynasty was destroyed, never to recover. The Tang court, once again refugees, was now utterly powerless. To defeat Hongqiao, they had to rely entirely on the strength of other warlords, effectively hiring barbarians to fight rebels. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but the dynasty was left a hollowed-out shell, completely at the mercy of the men who had saved it. The most powerful of these was Zhu Wen, a former lieutenant of Hongqiao who had defected to the Tang. He became the supposed protector of the emperor, but in reality he was his jailer. In 904, he had Emperor Shaozong assassinated and placed a 13-year-old child on the throne as his final puppet. 3 years later, the charade ended. In the year 907, Zhu Wen forced the boy emperor to formally abdicate, proclaiming himself the first emperor of a new dynasty, the later Liang.
After 289 years, the great Tang Dynasty, born in a military rebellion, had finally died at the hands of a warlord. And so the great dragon fell. After nearly 3 centuries of glory and tragedy, of unparalleled light and profound darkness, the Tang Dynasty was consigned to history. But what is left when the armies have scattered, the palaces have crumbled, and the emperors are but names in a book? What is the true legacy of the great Tang? First, it is a cultural zenith, a benchmark against which all subsequent eras are measured. The poetry of Li Bai and Du Fu became the soul of a language recited by children and scholars for 1,000 years. The cosmopolitan spirit of Chang'an, its confident embrace of the world, created a golden age of art and ideas. So profound was its influence that to this day in many parts of the world, the Chinese people are still known as the Tang people. Second, it is a timeless political lesson. The Tang provided the blueprint for a powerful centralized state, a model of governance that would shape East Asia for centuries. But its fall serves as an eternal warning. It was not destroyed by an external enemy, but by its own internal contradictions. The clash between court and province, between civil official and military general, between the emperor's authority and the eunuch's power. It teaches us that the most formidable walls are not those of a city, but those that grow between a ruler and his people, between the center and its periphery. Finally, its legacy is written in the cultures of its neighbors. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam all looked to the Tang as a model of civilization, adopting its laws, its writing, its philosophies, and its art. The shadow of this great dynasty stretches far beyond the borders of the Middle Kingdom. In the end, the story of the Tang is more than the story of a single dynasty. It is the universal story of every great power. It confirms the cyclical nature of history, that order is born from chaos, that glory contains the seeds of its own decay, and that the brightest light inevitably casts the longest shadow. The very military might that forged the empire created the warlords who tore it apart. The very wealth of the Silk Road bred the decadence that weakened the court. Glory will eventually turn to dust, but the lessons will last forever. The Tang Dynasty is gone, but the echo of its greatness and the lessons of its fall remain. The collapse of the Tang plunged China into another half-century of brutal division and warfare, a chaotic period known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms. But from these ashes, a new dynasty would rise, one that would reach new heights of scholarship, technology, and artistic refinement, even as it was haunted by a persistent military weakness against the new formidable empires rising on the northern steppes. Join us next time as we explore the complete history of the Song Dynasty. Thank you for joining Dast Saga on this journey through the glorious dust of the Great Tang. If this story has offered you new perspectives on the nature of power and history, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more chronicles of the world's great dynasties. History is always waiting to be told.